Hello and welcome to another painting video. It's our first video of 2025 and we're starting the year with a fresh new look. Today I'll be tackling the Never-Ending Nights, an awesome box set from the Moonstone game and part of the Shades of Moonreach faction. And wow, what a faction! I'm absolutely captivated by these bizarre and quirky models. We've got a cleric with a head of a donkey, a skeletal archer, and an undead noble knight. How delightfully eerie is that? Well, let's begin, shall we? Before I pick up my brush, I would like to take you through how I'm building the bases for these characters to stand on. After all, a good base can really bring the whole miniature to life. Let's start with the materials I'll be using. Printed some tombstones and grave markers to set the stage. What better way to give these undead characters a fitting atmosphere than a spooky graveyard? I've also gathered an assortment of dead trees and twisted branches, and some cobblestone pieces to add depth and texture. I'm also throwing in some mushrooms left over from my Gloomspite Git's army project. And I couldn't resist printing some cool graveyard fences to tie everything together. Of course, skulls are a must for a scene like this. What's a graveyard without a few bones lying around? I've also got cork that mimics rocky outcrops, and to finish things off, an array of tufts for that overgrown eerie feel. To build up some volume on the base, I'll be using milliput. I'll start by supergluing a generous blob of milliput to the base and spreading it evenly to cover the entire surface. This creates a sturdy foundation for everything else. Next, I add cobblestones, adding superglue and pressing each piece firmly into the soft milliput so they can fit snugly. The miniatures themselves get a bit of prep too. I remove the stub under the model as it is unnecessary and glue one foot directly into the milliput for a strong bond. Once the milliput cures, the model will be securely fixed in place. Next, I add larger decorative elements like a grave marker, angling it slightly so it creates a more dynamic look. I do the same with a graveyard fence, making sure it looks like it's sunken into the earth. These little details add so much character to the base. Once all major elements are in place, I turn to finishing touches. I glue tufts onto the milliput to add some overgrown organic texture. For even more variety, I apply foam flock with wood glue to mimic weeds creeping along the ground and sprinkling on some static grass for that extra layer of detail. This process does take some time, but it's absolutely worth the effort. Since I'm only basing a handful of models, I think it's a perfect opportunity to go that extra mile and make these bases as detailed and atmospheric as possible. Now it's time to prime the entire model. I start with a coat of black primer to ensure the shadows are deep and rich, setting a strong foundation for the darker tones to come. Next, I spray the entire model with royal purple, which will serve as the base color for all three miniatures. This rich, regal purple not only ties the set together, but also establishes the moody, otherworldly tone of the Shades of Moonreach faction. To finish the airbrushing, I apply a zenithal highlight using red-gray. This technique enhances the details of the models by creating natural gradients, making the painting process smoother later on. These gradients will be particularly useful when we start layering and highlighting. Let's start with my favorite model of the bunch, Greymair. This cleric's donkey-headed visage is as peculiar as it is delightful, and painting it is going to be a lot of fun. I begin with a base coat of Moonstone skin from Army Painter, applying a smooth, even layer over the donkey's face. This provides a solid starting point for that flashy tone. Next, I layer on barbarian flesh, carefully targeting the raised areas to build up depth and dimension. For highlights, I turn to Kislev Flesh, using the zenithal undercoat as a guide to emphasize the areas that catch the most light. This blending creates a soft, natural transition in the skin tones. For the gray areas of the donkey's head, I use uniform gray as the base, followed by ash gray to pick out the highlights and add definition. To unify the flesh tones and the gray areas, I shade the entire face with Reichland Flesh Shade. This step blends everything together nicely while adding depth to the recesses. To enhance the realism of the donkey's face, I add additional shading to areas with more blood flow, like the nose and ears, using Berserker Bloodshade. The gums get the same treatment, making them look more vibrant and lifelike. I paint the eyes and mane with Tenebrous Gray for a dark, dramatic base. The eyes are then dotted with uniform gray to give them a piercing look, and I use the same color to highlight the mane. For the final touch, I add a crisp white dot to the eyes for that glint of life. The donkey's teeth are base coated with Ushabti Bone and highlighted with Screaming Skull. With that, the wonderfully weird donkey face is complete. Greymair's robes are next, and I've decided to give them a weathered white appearance. I start with a base coat of worn stone, applying 3 thin layers for a smooth, even finish. For contrast, I paint a blue trim along the edges of the robes using a Lilac blue. Once the base colors are done, I shade the entire robe with Targor Raid Shade, which brings back a subtle purplish hue in the recesses and ties it to the base coat. To add texture, I roughly layer worn stone back onto the raised areas of the robe. This sketchy approach creates a worn, weathered look. The same method is applied to the blue trim with a Lilac blue. For highlights, I use Brain Matter Beige, feathering the edges to build a textured layered effect. If you prefer smoother gradients, glazing is an excellent alternative. The blue trim is brightened with Lothran Blue for a crisp finish. The cloak is base coated with Dark Reaper, applied in thin layers for a solid finish. Once dry, I shade it with Targor Raid Shade to deepen the shadows and emphasize the folds. For highlights, I layer Thunderhawk Blue onto the raised areas, followed by a final edge highlight of Pharisian Gray. This combination creates a cool look that contrasts nicely with the warmer tones on the base I'll be painting later. Staying true to the official artwork, I paint all the leather straps in a rich burgundy. The base coat is a dark burgundy, layered over with sword-hilt burgundy to brighten the midtones. For highlights, I mix sword-hilt burgundy with Kislev Flesh, applying this to the edges to give the leather a subtle sheen. For the copper details, I start with a base coat of Rhinox hide. I then layer on a mix of Rhinox hide and redskin flesh, leaving the deepest recesses untouched for contrast. Next, I apply a pure layer of redskin flesh, followed by a mix of redskin flesh and white to build up the shine. Each layer gets progressively smaller to create a reflective effect. Finally, I add pure white to the edges of the brightest highlights, giving the metal a polished, shiny appearance. The little Cycle Pump's dirty brown robe is base coated with Dryad bark. I layer on Baneblade Brown to bring out the midtones, and shade it with Seraphim Sepia to add warmth and to enhance the shadows. For highlights, I return with Baneblade Brown and add a final edge highlight of Ushabti Bone for extra definition. For the non-metallic parts, I begin with a base coat of Varisian Grey. The darker areas are painted with Lilac Blue. And I use Lothran Blue to blend the transitions between the light and dark areas. To emphasize the reflective surfaces, I bring back Varisian Grey to the brightest areas. And finish with sharp highlights of pure white. I base coat the banner with Cantor Blue. Then shade it with Targor Rage Shade for depth. For highlights, I layer on a Lilac Blue, followed by a final edge highlight of Hoeth Blue to make the banner stand out. Let's move on to our second model, Negroli, starting with his zombie skin. I begin with a base coat of necromantic flesh, applying it evenly to establish that sickly undead tone. To add depth and shadow, I shade the entire skin with Coelia Green Shade. This cool green wash enhances the natural recesses and creates a slightly eerie, decomposed effect. Next, I layer necrotic flesh back onto the raised areas, carefully preserving the shadows created by the wash. To build the highlights, I layer on grotesque green, focusing on smaller areas each time to create a gradual transition. For even brighter highlights, I mix grotesque green with ice yellow and apply this mix sparingly to the most prominent raised edges. Finally, I add the sharpest highlights using pure ice yellow, concentrating on areas like knuckles, cheekbones, and other sharp features. The result is skin that looks pallid and lifeless. Negroli's shorts get a striking red tone to contrast the coolness of his skin. I base coat them with Berserker Red, laying down a vibrant, rich foundation. For the highlights, I layer on Sanguine Scarlet first, focusing on the broader raised areas. I then transition to Demon Red, applying it more selectively to emphasize the higher points. Finally, I add an edge highlight with Kislev Flesh, which softens the red and gives the fabric a slightly worn look. His leggings are painted with a darker, more muted palette to complement the shorts. I base coat them with Stegadon Scale Green. I then layer with a mix of Stegadon Scale Green and Sons of Horus Green, blending the colors for a subtle gradient. For the final touch, I highlight the edges and raised folds with pure Sons of Horus Green, giving the leggings a polished, finished look. Negroli's armor needs to look dark, weathered, and a little eerie to suit his undead nature. I start with a base coat of Corvus Black. Now I love using Corvus Black because it's a slightly off black hue, which gives room to play with highlights and shading. To deepen the shadows, I apply Nuln Oil to the recesses. This step adds definition and prepares the armor for layering. I then layer on Dark Reaper as the first highlight, focusing on the broader edges and surfaces. Next, I use Deep Gray to refine the highlights further, gradually working towards smaller, more focused areas. Uniform Gray follows, adding a brighter edge to the reflective parts of the armor. For the highlight, I'll use Palette Switch Flash, applying it sparingly to the sharpest edges and corners to give the armor a ghostly reflective gleam. This pale tone adds a slightly ethereal quality to the armor, perfect for a model like Negroli. To finish, I dirty up the armor and tie it to this zombie aesthetic by applying a custom wash. I mix BL10 Green, Agrax Earthshade, and Lamia Medium to create a muted green-brown wash. This step adds a weathered, grimy appearance with a subtle greenish tint that complements the zombie skin nicely. To contrast the cool greens and muted tones, Negroli's cloak gets a rich burgundy finish. I start with a base coat of Mulled Berry, a deep and vibrant purple that immediately sets the tone. Next, I shade the cloak with Druky Violet, letting it settle into the folds and recesses to add depth and richness. For the highlights, I layer on Moldy Wine, applying it to the raised folds and edges to define the structure of the cloak. To finish, I mix Moldy Wine with Slaanesh Grey and apply this mix sparingly to the sharpest edges and peaks. This final highlight gives the cloak a subtle sheen and a dynamic appearance. Next up is Serif. To achieve a pale, eerie looking skull, I start by base coating the skull with Rakarth Flesh, ensuring smooth, even coverage. I shade the skull with a diluted Agrax Earthshade wash, focusing on the recesses to define the details and deepen the shadows. To bring back the pale tone, I layer on a mix of Rakarth Flesh and Palette Switch Flesh, keeping the previous shading visible in the recesses. Finally, I highlight the sharpest edges and prominent details with Palette Switch Flesh for a stark, bone-like appearance. I'm going to paint Serif's tunic in a soft beige tone. I begin with a base coat of Xandri Dust, applying thin layers for an even finish. I then shade the tunic with Agrax Earthshade, letting it settle into the folds for natural looking depth. To highlight, I layer on Karak Stone, focusing on the raised areas. Followed by a final highlight of Ushabti Bone to bring out the texture and give the tunic a warm, weathered look. Let's move on to the wooden elements. I base coat these areas with XV88, which gives a nice warm brown foundation. Next, I layer on Baneblade Brown, leaving some of the XV88 visible in the recesses for depth. Finally, I highlight the edges and grain with Karak Stone to create a light natural wood effect. I'm a big fan of Army Painter's Cobalt Metal, and it will be perfect for Serif's metallic details. I start by shading the helmet with Black Templar contrast paint to darken it, creating a striking base. For the chainmail, I'll use Nuln Oil instead, keeping it lighter to differentiate between the metallic textures. To highlight, I mix Iron Hand Steel with Cobalt Metal and apply it to the edges and raised areas. For the final highlight, I use a mix of Runefang Steel and Cobalt Metal, adding a bluish reflective sheen that complements the darker tones nicely. The little Psychopomp's ethereal blue skin is next. I begin with a base coat of Verizian Grey, applying thin layers to avoid obscuring details. I shade the skin with Coelia Green shade, letting it settle into the crevices for a subtle definition. For the first layer, I mix Verizian Grey with Blue Horror and apply it to the raised areas. I then build up the highlights with a mix of Blue Horror and Palace Witch Flesh, focusing on the most prominent features. Finally, I paint the eyes with Imperial Fist contrast paint, which contrasts nicely with the light blue skin and makes his face pop. Now on to the base. I start by highlighting the various objects with Slanesh Grey, picking out edges and raised surfaces. I add another highlight with Pastel Violet, and a final highlight with Pastel Pink to create depth and variation. Using my airbrush, I spray Rose Light ink over the entire base for a soft glowing effect. I spray selected areas with a magenta ink to create darker hues. Next, I apply Villainy Ink's Carrion Crimson over the base objects. Then, with a cotton tip and some mineral spirits, I remove the excess ink, revealing the highlights underneath for a distressed, worn look. For the grasses, I dry brush Pastel Pink to give them a subtle glow, tying them into the overall color scheme. And finally, I paint the rim of the base with Corvus Black for a nice clean finish. And there you have it, the never-ending nights. These shades of Moonreach models were such a joy to paint, and I can't wait to tackle more from this faction. This was a bit of a longer video, but that's the advantage of skirmish games. You can really take the time to add extra details when you're only working on a few models. In my next video, I'm painting more Shades of Moonreach faction models with the Freaky Fudge Day box. In the meantime, be sure to follow me on Instagram, where I share behind the scenes photos and updates on current projects. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thanks for watching.